another summer weekend in the books. Classes are starting across the country, which is pretty wild. To me, at least, as a Northwestern guy, our classes will not be underway for well over a month, Brad, which is it's pretty wild. I spent my weekend. I was at Saratoga on Sunday at the track. Busy day in the college basketball world up there. Jeff Goodman was up there per Twitter. I briefly caught a glimpse of Siena head coach Carm Massarello. So all the college basketball stars were out. I made like $20. It was a great day to be alive.
Sounds cool. Doing some horse gambling up there.
Oh yes,
channeling your inner Mike Francesa.
Nah, I mean it's really funny when I see like celebs at Saratoga like on Twitter. I'm like, how is this happening? Because it's just been so ingrained to me from my life that it's just like a thing that's there that you don't always like understand. It's like a special thing that other people go to. So that's pretty cool. Cool thing to be in my backyard. So fun times doing that. But it would be nice to have some games to watch, certainly.
Yeah, and we had the Team USA scrimmage on Friday, which I watched 3 quarters of. People really freaking out about that team. I mean, that team's going to be fine. I still think that they win the World Cup there. I haven't gotten too much into the scrimmages yet, the various college foreign trip scrimmages. I know Texas Tech was playing Mega BMAX, which is a prominent farm development team out in I think Lithuania maybe, which they just take a lot of younger guys from different European countries usually that are on the NBA draft radar, and they usually get a couple in every draft. So like last year they played Kentucky, and they had Goga Bitadze, who was a first-round pick this year for the Pacers. And they also had Kostija Mashuti, who was a former guy who, in like the preseason for a couple of years was like, all right, this guy's going to be a lottery pick. I think with injuries and poor play, he's now more of a fringe guy. But that's, watching a Mega BMAX game, you might be able to catch a future NBA guy. And Texas Tech was fooling around with lineups. I saw today, I think Moretti, Clark, and Ramsey didn't play, and they lost by like 3 or 4.
Well, and Ramsey had a 44-point, 13 rebound performance in game 2, which is kind of ridiculous. Like, they went 1-2 on their trip. I'm just not really worried, right? Like, we know that, like, if anything, I was just impressed they could score. I was impressed that Jameis Ramsey put up numbers. I was impressed that Chris Clark put up numbers in game 1. It's a trip. You got to fool around with things. And I saw Will Brown from Albany was tweeting about how he played all 13 guys and no one played more than 20 minutes. Like, you just have to take them for what they are. And I'd rather see strong individual performances. I know Junior Lamamba did have 32 points once in a international trip game, Brad. I know what you're going to say, but no, I think it's good to see strong individual performances more so than team results. Not that team results don't matter, but especially when you consider the context oftentimes.
I meant to fact check that too to get the exact total. I'm pretty sure it's 32 points. But that was a weird year too because Chris Dunn was still recovering, and we saw this with Illinois this year too, that they can't bring their international guys. Right? They couldn't bring Andres Felice and Kofi Cockburn. Providence that year couldn't bring Bentel or Pascal Chukwu. So, it's just like a collection of 6 or 7 guys getting all the run. So that's why guys like Lamamba and Cartwright were able to, play so much then. But yeah, interesting to watch. Kind of wish I watched some of those Texas Tech games. I wish more were televised instead of being on Flow Hoops and paying things like $13 a month. But then there was something else I think where like you had to pay more for the whole year. So I don't know. It was too complicated. I wasn't going to get in for some mostly meaningless preseason scrimmages.
I think it's like $30 a month if you go monthly, or like way cheaper if you go yearly. But I'm just never going to need it yearly unless I want to watch like a bunch of CAA games. So, I mean, it was just a little too steep for me. Hopefully we'll get some just Facebook live streams and stuff like that. I know I heard a really fun story about a Memphis fan who's retired and just brought an iPad and a tripod and was like streaming it on their Facebook group, which I thought was pretty cool. It's just stupid stuff like that. So I don't know how good the quality is. I didn't get a chance to watch because I'm not a member of said Facebook group, but it's always things, and the fans will do anything to get their hands on that video. I will say that. So it's always fun. Hopefully, we'll get some more info and stats from trips. Obviously, we take it with somewhat of a grain of salt, but to get some of that data in before the start of the season. However, the biggest news of probably of the summer, Brad. I mean, it is massive stuff that what Oregon has pulled off. They land a 5-star in Dante. They land a top 45 recruit reclassifying up in Addison Patterson. The Canada connection staying strong with that one. And all of a sudden, Oregon went from having 6 scholarship players on May the 20th to having a legit national title contender in my mind.
I think it's a little too aggressive. I have them. I think I'm still evaluating them, obviously, but tentatively in that 10 to 13 range. Previously talked about how, for me, the top 12 kind of separated itself, and I would certainly throw Oregon in that mix now. So I rank them around like Memphis, Seton Hall, Texas Tech, UNC, right in that mix for me.
Yeah. So I have an 8.
I mean, there's just so much roster turnover again for Oregon, which is what plagues them the past few years. So while they got all this new talent in, and now they have this really rock solid 9-man rotation. I mean, the Patterson news wasn't as impactful as people are making out to be, because I think he's going to be like the 8th man, and play like 13 minutes a game as a freshman. Now this is a much bigger deal down the road. But in terms of their team from next year, I don't think it moves the needle a ton.
No, I mean, I think it helps a little bit just to have one other like true wing, right? Because they have they have 4 really good guards. They have Mathis, Richardson, Pritchard, and
Duarte.
Yes, Duarte. So they have 4 ones and 2s, because Richardson's like a 2 guard, and then they have a bunch of 4s and 5s where they CJ Walker is like a combo forward, but he's probably better at the 4. Houston, you have Infali Dante, Okoro. They have 4 really good 4s and 5s, 4 really good 1s and 2s, and they were going to have to play someone a little bit out of position. Patterson could give them that true wing to slot in there. I don't know. I don't think he starts, but I think he'll play minutes, as you said. And I just think the recipe is right to be a contender, right? I mean, I understand there's not a lot of roster continuity, but there's not a lot of roster continuity on Duke or Kentucky or Memphis or a lot of these teams that we're going to consider in the elite. I mean, Kansas doesn't have a ton of roster continuity. Udoka didn't play last year for the most part, right? I mean, it's a bunch of rotation players and guys stepping up and taking bigger roles. There's just not a ton of teams with a lot of roster continuity. And I think if you have a team like Oregon that has top 15 point guard in the country, Peyton Pritchard, elite big man and Infali Dante, grad transfer shooter, 2 good rotation or better guards in Duarte and Will Richardson, grad transfer big in Houston who'll play. Okoro is a piece who can give you minutes. Patterson's a top 50 recruit. The roster construction is the way I would build a contender in this day and age in college basketball. And I think they have all the pieces obviously have to come together, and I could be disappointed, but in a situation where we're not trusting a lot of teams, I think they deserve to be right in that mix, and I think they have a chance to win a national title. Now, obviously, I don't think, I think it's kind of pointless to come in and say, okay, there's 6 teams preseason that can win a national title, because obviously we're going to change our opinions throughout the season. But I think they have the mix of talent, coaching, and experience that I'll take and go into March with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's fair. But, I mean, in terms of comparing them to the Kentucky and the Duke, I mean, they have more talent. And I think Kansas certainly has more continuity, because they, between Dodson, Agbaji, Garrett, and then Azubuike was around. But, I mean, McCormick is back from last year. Silvio De Souza was around, I think, last year. I'm not sure if he could practice last year, but I mean they certainly have more back than Oregon, which is really only returning Pritchard and Richardson, and then Okoro, right?
Yeah, I guess I don't I guess I wonder what's the impact of truly like being back in like how beneficial is it like if Udoka wasn't practicing all year and like how much familiarity is there really on the floor between Udoka and Dotson? Body's a rising sophomore who didn't play for most of the season. Like you're D'Souza is another guy who didn't play last year. Like to me, it starts to become a how much more valuable is it to have guys who've just been together if they haven't really played together? And I'm not saying Kansas doesn't have more continuity. They certainly do. I just don't think you can use Kansas's continuity necessarily in its favor in evaluating that national title conversation.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest pause about this, whether it's unfair or not, is, I mean, right, Oregon goes to the Final Four. They lose a bunch of guys to the NBA. The next year, they built a very good team, right? They had Mikhail McIntosh. They had Troy Brown, who's first-round pick. They had Pritchard back from the year prior. They had Elijah Brown, who could score. He's bounced around on a few different summer league teams. So, I mean, he's talented. And that team really flopped based on expectations. And then this past year, they eventually found their groove, but that was a unanimous top 25 team that needed the auto bid.
Okay, but I don't necessarily think that's fair when you consider the fact that like that 2017 team, or 2017-2018 team, I don't think you can compare on a talent level, right? That team was sophomore Peyton Pritchard needing a big jump, and he had the jump.
Well, I mean, he was a starter on a Final Four team the year before.
But he had to make a big jump. He was like role player to, highly impactful. You had Troy Brown, who disappointed. He was not very good. Elijah Brown was a chucker. Mikhail McIntosh was a good role player on a fringe at-large team who became a good role player. They had no interior presence. Paul White was just out there chucking threes. Right? I mean, Vic Bailey was a chucker. Like, that roster construction just wasn't there for me to really compare that to this team that is so well built, that is so much more talented in my mind. And then last year, right? Like, Bull gets hurt. I mean, they were disappointing before Bull gets hurt, but I mean, he gets hurt. That throws off your plan, certainly. Luke King took forever to get going. I mean, is some of that coaching? Maybe, but I just don't. I don't know that I just don't think we can compare on a roster level a roster that was Peyton Pritchard, Ehab Amin, Luke King when he decided to show up, Paul White playing big minutes, Wooten, to what they've got this year. I just don't think it's a reasonable comparison.
So I really, really disagree with that, because that's like in hindsight we're saying this stuff, right? But Troy Brown was a 5-star recruit. Luke King was a 5-star recruit, right? Wooten is a fringe NBA player now. I mean, we were all singing the praises of the Ehab Amin addition, right? As this kind of slashing defensive-minded guard, right? A lot of people, myself included, really liked Abu Kijab coming into the year.
Yeah.
Richardson was a top 40 recruit. I mean, even Paul White's a former top 50 recruit, and he's not like a great he's not like a very desirable archetype these days, but I mean, he still averaged double figures.
I don't know.
I don't see how even without Bull, how last year's Oregon team was any less talented than this year's Oregon team.
Okay, so I'll just go through it. I'd take Houston over Paul White. I'd take Anthony Mathis over I'd take Anthony Mathis over Ehab Amin. I'd take Will Richardson this year over Will Richardson last year. I'd take Duarte in over Victor Bailey. I would take Pritchard this year over Pritchard last year. And then Dante just dominated Peach Jam, right? Like, maybe I'm looking at it on a bit of a positive. I'm looking at it a bit too positively, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say that the potential is way up here. At least, I maybe I'm buying too much stock, but I think maybe I'm just overvaluing some of their assets. Like, I'm just high on all of their guys. But like, to me, it's really tough to say, oh, well, they lost Kenny Wooten, but they got N'Faly Dante, right? Like, to me, that's not a like for like. That's like, N'Faly Dante's an elite recruit who can dominate the game, and Kenny Wooten's a guy who like protects the rim and kind of impacts things defensively.
Right, but that's exactly what we would have said in the preseason of last year, because Oregon was a unanimous top 25 team. Most people having them in the top 15 range. At the like it's like we can look back now and kind of label these guys as disappointments. But I mean, in the preseason, we said the same thing about Oregon the year prior, right? And they were only incrementally better. We take junior Peyton Pritchard over sophomore Peyton Pritchard. We take Lou King over Mikhail McIntosh. We take sophomore Victor Bailey over freshman. We'd say Will Richardson's a top 50 recruit. I mean, it's to me we're saying the same thing, and I think it was probably the cohesion, because as the year went on, despite being less talented, losing Bull, they were significantly better. So now, if it takes Oregon a while to get going again, then you can't live up to a top 10 ranking if you start slow, right? You can live up to making the NCAA tournament and winning a game in that 12-5 setting, but you can't really make it back to the top 10 after a slow start.
And I will note, kind of in support of your point, both Patterson and N'Faly Dante and Houston, more than likely, will not have been on campus for summer session. So that does probably impact things a little bit in terms of chemistry. There's just a little less time together. There's no international trip. There's no, extra time for building bonds and getting together. So I'll note that. But I'm a big believer in the roster. I think, it's set to maximize a lot of Pritchard's strengths. It's set to, have multiple ball. Because, we do these deep dives, right? I always say, okay, I want teams that have multiple ball handlers that can attack you with multiple guys and set you in ball screens. I want teams that can beat you inside or out. I want teams that have, versatility defensively and can switch. I want teams that, have overall athleticism and overall talent level. I want rim protection. Like, I just go through this roster and I say, check, 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 check. And I think Dana Altman probably still counts as a check, right? Like, I know 2 years in a row that we haven't really loved this Oregon team, and maybe they've been a little bit poorly coached at times, but I think Dana Altman's still a good coach. He's been to a Final Four, just went to a Sweet 16. I think I have a tough time not falling in love with this group, and maybe that's irrational, but I'm big on them.
Well, I mean, we talked about a little bit of this with Juice in terms of Seton Hall and like how he would be better at the 5 than the 4. I mean, he's gonna play probably almost exclusively the 4 at Oregon. How do you see that kind of shaking out, right? Because he's not a floor spacer at all. Playing him with Dante together in that front court.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously something that I'm generally anti playing two bigs, but I think you could play 20 minutes of him at the 4 and 20 minutes of CJ Walker at the 4. You might even play 4 guards and play Patterson at the 4. Right? Like, you're gonna see him play. I don't think he's a guy who's gonna play 30 minutes a night. I think he's gonna be 15 to 25. So I'm okay to play some 2 big looks, especially if Houston is a guy who faces up a lot. I mean, he's not a guy who's just sitting on the block. He's gonna run around and face up and make a step through move and stuff like that. So I don't think it'll wreck spacing too much, but it is something to watch.
Okay, we wanted to move on to something else that I can't remember.
You want to quickly probably touch on Illinois?
Wasn't there something else too?
I don't remember, quite frankly.
Oh no, it was Virginia Tech.
Oh yes, Virginia Tech got Darius Maddox, which is a big one. Mike Young's recruiting.
Yeah, so they have Maddox, who's a top 70, like a scoring wing, and then they have Joe Bamisile, the former Northwestern commit. So that's quite the start to the class, right? But I think we really have to take a step back and kind of consciously or like explicitly state like what we consider a good and a bad hire, right? Like if the hire itself makes sense at the time, but the team, but like the results don't work out, right? So let's say that Illinois doesn't make the tournament this year, right? And then they say they fire Brett Underwood. I still think I would consider that a good hire because of the profile of candidate, but it just didn't work out. So with the Mike Young thing, so now this is why we have to take the step back, because at the time I labeled it a bad hire because I didn't see how he was going to get them out of this gutter that Buzz Williams left them in. But I mean, Mike Young is a very good coaching candidate. I mean, Wofford was awesome this year. And he's started to really get the ball rolling between the two we just mentioned and Jalen Cone and bringing Keve Aluma back from Wofford. But I'm still very skeptical of Virginia Tech being able to climb the standings anytime soon, because so this year they're going to be horrible. Virginia Tech fans, from what I've seen, don't understand this, but like that roster is horrible. It's just like they're going to go like 3-15 or 3-17, however many games the ACC has now. So you know they're adding these top recruits, right, between Cone and Landers Nolly too. But they need more established guys. It's like whether it's a 3-star guy that you hit on or getting a bunch of transfers. They need a little bit of luck in addition to these top recruits in order to climb out anytime soon. So I'm still kind of skeptical of Virginia Tech making a move up the standings in the near future. The only thing I would criticize Mike Young on would be taking some of these guys instead of going heavy on the transfer market. I don't know besides KV Aluma which transfers were really realistic, but given what we know about the transfer market, they should have been able to get at least one or two more sit-out guys instead of kind of filling the roster with some of this back-end stuff.
I mean, I don't think they really filled it too bad. Like, they went grad transfer with Brandon Johnson. Look at that spot back. He was our only senior, so they had to fix that. I mean, he was left, like, Mike Young was left a dumpster fire roster, right? Like, he had Landers Nolly, he had Beatty, who's like a good game manager, and he had a couple of lottery tickets, like a PJ Horn, like John Kabongo. Like, he had Beatty, Nolly, and a couple of lottery tickets, and he turned that into already has turned that into Jalen Cone, Naheem Aline, who put up good numbers in EYBL, Project Big Man in John Ogiaco, Aluma, two potential, very good starters in Bamasil and Maddox, possibly all-conference guy in Bamasil. He was super high. They're going to get one or two more good recruits in this class based on, they're in PJ Hall, Henry Coleman. Like, they have shots on those guys.
Well, right? I mean, they're not going to get either of those guys.
I don't know.
I think Duke and Florida.
Probably. But, they're in on a bunch of guys. They'll probably get one or two more good ones. At some point, if you committed to Mike Young, you were committed to a long build. They couldn't have hired Musk because he wouldn't have gone. But, if you wanted to say, okay, let's grab every transfer on the board and let's try to flip it quick, they could have found Musk. But you knew as soon as Buzz left and that class left that this was a long-term play. So you can't. I don't think you can go out there and try to treat it like it's not a long-term play, and be at all critical if it takes time, right? Like, you have a coach who's stated a vision, who's recruiting extremely well to that vision, right? Like, Mike Young historically has played 4-out-1 in basketball, has spaced it out, has had a lot of shooters. He's recruited a lot of athletes and a lot of shooters who play the guard positions. that's the right track. And, I'm not saying he's like got a Rutgers type cell of vision like Steve Peichel, but I don't think it's I think it's unfair to Mike Young. You say, okay, so maybe you didn't like the hire, but I don't necessarily think it's fair to Mike Young to say, okay, well, why isn't it going to come faster? Because he's bringing the talent and he's bringing it way quicker than I thought he would. If the concern was, oh, he's not going to recruit, well, that's gone.
Yeah. I was saying, I considered it a bad hire because of where Virginia Tech was. So I'm amending that to I think it was a fine hire. I just don't believe it's going to work out. I think Buzz left him too big of a hole to climb out of.
That's reasonable. Okay. I think as long as he's given time and, by recruiting well in this class, I think he's earned time. They'll be fine. That's my thought on it.
Want to move on to Arkansas?
Yeah, we probably should. Otherwise, we'll talk all day.
That was fun.
It was fun. I enjoyed it.
Arkansas, surprisingly good last year, I thought. 54th in KenPom, 18-16 overall, 8-10 in the SEC. Made the second round of the NIT, destroying Providence in a game I really wish I didn't watch, because I think it was Belmont Temple was on at the same time, and I chose to watch my team suffer a slow and painful death. It was almost a whole new team after losing Macon and Barford and tons of other seniors around Daniel Gafford. Gafford surprisingly returns, and Arkansas was able to exceed expectations due to the surprise performances of Isaiah Joe and Mason Jones on the wing. So they were 347th in defensive rebounding, despite Gafford being in the top 153 of both offense and defensive rebounding. I think it was 153 in offensive rebounding, like 117th in defensive rebounding. But the team itself, 347th. And it's not going to get any better this year, and which is a tiny, tiny team. They were 16th in forcing turnovers, playing that fast pace, and they were 332nd in allowing free throws. And they were a strong team in getting to the line, but only 308th in a free throw percentage. And then in terms of kind of their forcing turnovers, on the defensive side, they were 7th in block percentage, 25th in steals percentage. The first one's definitely going to be gone now with Gafford leaving. So they were only 222nd in points off of 3-pointers, despite having a prolific shooter in Isaiah Joe and another very strong shooter in Mason Jones. And so for this year, returning 6 of the 7, only person in the top 7 that they're losing is also their best player, Daniel Gafford. And they're also upgrading the point guard position with Jimmy Witt. And then last year, talking about that, they lost all those seniors. They were 341st in experience and 334th in minutes continuity. And then in terms of kind of what Muss is going to bring, looking at Nevada's KenPom numbers from the past few years, I thought Nevada played a faster pace. They are still in the top third of pace, maybe even the top fourth. Like the top 25% of pace. But Anderson played much faster last year than Muss did during his time at Nevada. But one quality which I would not be surprised if we see Musk carrying it over to this year, hardly using the bench. Right, they were in the 340s, I think, in a bench usage at Nevada, and this Arkansas eligible roster only has 9 or 10 guys right now, and I would expect Muss to kind of carry over that bench philosophy. And they also were surprisingly good at taking care of the ball at Nevada. I think having guys like Cody Martin who could play some point guard, but could also play with a point guard. Certainly helped, and I'm not sure Arkansas can replicate that this year, but that's something to watch as well.
Okay, so before I launch into in and out, I think I'd like to take a little bit of stock of the coaching change for Arkansas. Because you said it, they were surprisingly good last year. Like, if you told us preseason that Arkansas would be a top 60 Ken Pom team, would finish over 500, would make the NIT, would win an NIT game in a strong SEC when the roster was down, I think we would have said, I mean, that's not maybe not best case scenario, but that's pretty close, right? Like, we were down on Arkansas.
Yeah, so I had Arkansas like just outside the top 100 in the preseason, which put him like 12th in the SEC. Then when I was writing an article about Isaiah Joe in the preseason about potentially surprising because he's a shooter playing around Gafford, I stumbled onto an Arkansas message board where their fans were basically saying NCAA tournament or bust, and they were very insistent that they had an NCAA tournament team and that they should be ranked in the 40s essentially, which I thought was crazy. I mean, no one had them anywhere close to that. But I mean, they were closer than like the consensus there. They were still a little too high on Arkansas, but certainly 54th was surprising because right they lose Barford and Macon to the NBA. Barford graduates. He was a fringe NBA guy. They also lose Anton Beard, who averaged 30 minutes a game. Dustin Thomas, Trey Thompson, and Orlando Cook in the front court all saw rotation minutes. And they lost two guys unexpectedly who were expected to step into starting roles. And C.J. Jones, who transferred to Middle Tennessee, and Darius Hall, who transferred to DePaul. So like both those guys were probably slated to start. And then once they left, I really wrote off Arkansas. But then after reading about basically why their fans were so high on them, I moved them into the 90s, but I was still about 40 spots off.
Right, and so I think it presents an interesting question. I think part of the expectations being crazy were because of Gafford returning, right? Like, no one would have expected them to be very good if Gafford was. But I also think it's like Arkansas is one of the few SEC programs that's more of a basketball job over a football job. Like, they really care about their hoops. They have history, with Nolan Richardson running that show, and they have an expectation they have really high standards at Arkansas. Where I went on the radio in Fayetteville one day, probably in early February, where you could tell they weren't making the NCAA tournament. You knew that, but I didn't think Mike Anderson's firing was on the radar at that point. And I was asking, what do you think of Mike Anderson? I said, quite frankly, I think it's a talent race because the rest of the SEC is recruiting at a little higher level than he is. But he's got Joe, he's got Jones, he's probably going to lose Gafford, but he's got a nice little nucleus. The question is, can he get enough talent around him that it's enough to get back in the NCAA tournament contention? And the talk show host, close to berated me. I have never been, so criticized on the air. He literally said something to the extent of, I think, I appreciate you answering, so I forget the exact word he used, but, politically correct or something like that. But I think it's a disaster, and I think it's ridiculous for anyone to think it's not a disaster what's going on with this Arkansas program right now. Like, the expectations were just so up here. And, is that realistic for what Arkansas is right now in the modern college basketball area? Let's find out. But, I think they took the right step if they were going to make a coaching change by hiring Eric Musselman, who I think is one of the best coaches in college basketball.
Yeah, I think that was a great hire. He's someone who's certainly going to turn it around with the transfers, for better or worse. He's in the mix for every transfer. But I think one thing that doomed Anderson was they had a really good team with Bobby Portis. That was like an 8 seed, and they beat Seton Hall controversially in the first round. And they pushed, I think it was UNC to the wire in the second round, right? If they pull off that win over UNC, that might have been the year that UNC won it all too. It was either Villanova, it was okay. But if they pull off that game, I mean that changes the whole trajectory for Anderson, because the whole thing right, is that Arkansas hasn't made a Sweet 16 since like the 90s or whatever. Since it was all those Final Fours. But just a bounce here, a bounce there. You go from a guy who could be a even more long-term fixture in Anderson to a guy who's run out of town even after overachieving.
Right. It's one of those things where when you have deep tournament runs, you buy yourself more time. And Anderson didn't have a deep tournament run to buy himself more time. The athletic director wanted new blood in there, which I understand. I think, Anderson. I think the one thing with coaching changes, right, is like if the program in September is in a better shape than it was in March, then you have to feel pretty good. And I think right now the program is in better shape. So, whether you agree with firing Anderson, you think it was justified or not, the ends may justify the means because they hired a really good coach who has things on the right track.
Yeah, and I mean, so the guys who Muss has brought in so far, JD Notte, Connor Vancouver, and the guy from Stetson whose name escapes me right now.
Abayomi Iola.
I mean, those guys aren't the Martins, right? They're not Jordan Caroline. Like they're not even Trey Porter in terms of how good they are. So that's something that I expect Musselman to keep trying to upgrade on the transfer market continuously. I know many people, myself included, were surprised. They had Jalen Harris, who was solid last year as a starting point guard. They go and upgrade and get Jimmy Witt in there, who, I mean, maybe they play together some, but that's playing two non-shooters at once. But I mean, they have two solid options now, but Witt is the superior player.
Yeah, I think the transfers you got this offseason are very much role players, and they're very much insurance for, okay, we're going to lose Witt, very possibly is Joe, Gene Talsilla, who they grabbed as a grad kid, and Adrio Bailey. So that's 4 rotation players at a bare minimum. I think Muss's philosophy is, we're really not going to take mid-year guys. We might as well take these sit-out guys. They're rotation players, and we will have spots to go give next class. I think that's the justification there. But I do agree, they're not studs. I think it's a pretty good chance, though, to break down exactly who's in and who's out with Arkansas. There was a fair amount of turnover. We mentioned the 3 sit-out transfers: J.D. Notte, Connor Vancouver, and Abayomi Iola. Iola from Stetson is like a somewhat undersized for that level, big man, but very physical, can play down low. Kind of reminiscent to me of Prince Oduro, who's headed to Mississippi State from Siena. He's available this year after redshirting. A guy who wasn't super efficient around the rim, not huge for the SEC. I don't know how those guys will adjust and play in SEC basketball, but they also might be helped by having spacing and having talent around them. Vanover is kind of this very unique 7 foot, I believe 7'3", can really shoot it. I don't know what he's going to be as a college basketball player. I think developing for a year will help. He could be a stretch 5 for Muss. That's interesting. Notte, like a combo guard, he can create a little bit, dish out for others. Was a guy who stuck around the transfer market a little longer than I think some of those elite transfers did. So that could indicate something in terms of what others thought about him on the market. Maybe a backup plan for some other programs, but he comes in as well. And then the 2 grad transfers, Jimmy Witt from SMU and Gene Talsilla from UNCW, will both play rotation minutes, if not more, this season. Out goes Daniel Gafford to the NBA, Keyshawn Embry Simpson to Tulsa, Ibi Ali to Tulane, Justice Hill to JUCO, Khalil Garland to a medical retirement, and just recently Gabe Osabuyen was dismissed from the team. So some names in, some names out, but maybe not quite the roster turnover you could have seen with a Muss team.
Absolutely, and I think the first thing that really stands out with this team is just their lack of size, right? So they were 347th in defensive rebounds. Only 7 teams were worse on the glass last year, and that's with having an NBA center who was very good on that side of the ball. Now they're going to either use probably a mix of Adriel Bailey and Reggie Chaney, who are 6'6" and 6'8", respectively, at that center spot. I mean, that's the one major concern for me is the lack of size and all the implications between rebounding and defense that kind of coincide with that.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of size is concerning to a level, but I'm not as worried about it as you are, and I'll give you 2 reasons why. So the first one is, look up and down Mike Anderson's history as a coach. He has never had good defense. He's never had good defensive rebounding teams. Last year they were 347th, but the year before 298. The year before 333, 190. The year before was actually his best total as a D1 head coach. 319, 342, 248, 318, 318, 332, 244. He's always been bad. Going back to Missouri, he has just never had good rebounding teams, and I think a fair amount of that is just the style that they play and the constant ball pressure. I think that does impact things certainly, but let's compare that to Eric Musselman. They've never had horrible defensive rebounding. He was 204 in his worst year, and that was a team they were playing Carolina at the 5 and 4 guards. Last year they were 36th in defensive rebounding, 52nd the year that they made the NCAA tournament in 2017, where they were playing Cam Oliver and Jordan Caroline together. Now this is going to be a team that plays smaller, but they're going to play 2 forwards at least. I think they'll be better than you think on the glass, and I think combined with the ability of Reggie Chaney to block shots, he had 7 block shots in that game against Providence that you mentioned before. He's a guy on my breakout list for the season. I think he's going to be really, really good. I think he fits what Muss wants to do as like an undersized roll man who could protect the rim and bring that energy. I don't want to place Jordan Caroline level expectations on him because I don't think he has the ball skills, but I think he could really make an impact as that smaller 5 who really impacts the game. He was a good recruit out of high school. He's very athletic. He has very good rim protecting instincts. 1.4 blocks a game in 16 minutes. Had some big totals. I think he's a guy that you can really watch and see have a big year protecting the rim. So those 2 factors combined make me a little less concerned than you would be about the size concern.
And I really like Chaney, right? Former top 150-ish recruit. You mentioned his game against Providence. He was a force in that one, as was Ethan Henderson, who barely played last year, played like 51 minutes, and he'll be a factor to it more at the 4 probably. But while the Anderson teams historically are bad rebounding teams, besides Chaney, who I think will be like a positive rebound guy, but not probably the same rebounding that Gafford was last year. I don't really see where it's coming from, right? Because the wings aren't great rebounding guys. Scylla only averaged 5 rebounds a game at UNC Wilmington, which is fine, right? But that's not like a super impactful number for a 4-man. So they may have to use more Bailey Chaney lineups, Henderson Chaney as well, and then they, I don't know how big of a deal that this will be, but they also have this guy Emeka Obukwelu, who averaged 20 and 8 in Division III for Texas Tyler. I watched a YouTube video. Reminds me of like a poor man's Femi Olajobi. I have no idea if this will translate, but I think with only having 9 scholarship guys that are in the mix, and being a small team, I think he probably gets a look. So that's a guy to keep an eye on. But I think if the front court is going to get solved, it's going to be Henderson making a big jump and playing a lot of 4, and then Chaney, as you mentioned, really taking a big step at the 5.
Well, I think Witt's a good rebounder. I think Scylla might be a good rebounder. He just had to grab the ball out of the bottom of the net because UNC Wilmington gave up buckets at the rate that everybody did. That's mostly a joke, but I think between Chaney, between keeping it fresh with guys like Bailey potentially playing some 4, or Henderson playing some 4, I think they'll be fine. It's not gonna be a strength, but I think they can hang around against a lot of SEC teams. I don't think they're gonna get hammered on the glass. Is my point, at least. Like they were hammered on the glass last year. I think they'll be better than they were last year. despite losing Dan Gafford. Stylistically, adding Witt, who's a really good rebounder, getting Isaiah Joe stronger, so he's not just a shooter. Jones is still there. He's an average rebounder for his position. Chaney. I think they'll be fine in that area.
Like we did last time with Ohio State's, can they conceivably go small among the conference? Just going through some SEC front lines. Kentucky's always going to be a problem for people. Richards, Montgomery, Sestino, Whitney, with the size and athleticism there. Florida with Blackshear and their collection of backup centers of Bassett and stuff. I mean, that's Florida certainly has a size advantage there. I don't think that's too bad of a mismatch. The Johnson and Blackshear versus in Arkansas front court. Tennessee's small. Fulkerson and Pons are super athletic, but they're not like really impact guys. Even if they really rebound, they're not going to kill you. Auburn with Austin Wiley is big, but they play a more perimeter-oriented four in a Purifoy. Alabama should be pretty small. We went through them a couple months ago with their three-headed monster at center and then playing like a small ball four. South Carolina might even go small this year after going big for a few straight years, sliding Coatsar to the 5 and him and McKay at Henry. Ole Miss, that's not a scary front line with Hinson, Buffett, and Kadeem Sy. So just off the top of my head, the SEC's front lines aren't too crazy. Besides Kentucky, where I think Arkansas could get beat up.
Yeah, no, I'll buy that for sure. And I think there's also as long as your 5 can hold your own with the other team's 5, I think I'm willing to get mauled by another team's 4 if it's going to give me a speed advantage on the offensive end. I think that's kind of my thought process on it. But the upside in this team really lies in the guards. I don't think that's a secret. I mean, Jimmy Witt is, for this team to reach what I have them as, which is a top 30 team, which I think you're probably going to wildly disagree with, Brad. That is Isaiah Joe making a jump, Mason Jones fitting in, and Jimmy Witt being a above average SEC point guard. If not, top 5.
Yeah, so I don't have them anywhere close to the top 30. I have them at 67, which is 10th in the SEC. I'm thinking about switching them in Missouri, who I have in 11th. So probably the 9, 10, 11 range for me between Tennessee, Arkansas, and Missouri, all in that NIT spot. I just don't get the same enthusiasm out of this team. We had mentioned earlier with their, with the sit-out transfers being role players. I think Jimmy Witt is one of the best grad transfers on the market. I think he's probably a top 10 in terms of impact. He put up great numbers in the AAC for SMU, but I don't is he going to be their best player?
No.
I know Joe's their best prospect, but I mean he does little else outside of shooting. Is with the Witt's ability to play both sides of the ball. I mean, I think he could be their best player. But even if not, is a big 3 of Witt, Joe, and Jones surrounded by a bunch of solid role players? Is that enough to be a tournament team, you think?
Yeah, I do. Mostly because I think Isaiah Joe is going to be a top 10 player in the SEC. I think he's expanded his overall game from what I've seen. I think, he has the ability to, absolutely take over a game with his shooting, but he can also, he's not just a catch and shoot guy. He can get it on his own a little bit. I think that'll only continue to grow. He has to continue to do that to open up things for his shot, because otherwise he's just a shooter. But I think he's improved in that area. His versatility, or not his versatility, his gravity was the word I was looking for. His gravity is, super impactful, because you're talking about a guy like Jimmy Witt. Okay, great slasher, good passer, rebounder, switchable defender. that guy struggles in a team with no spacing. On a team that has very good spacing, which a must team will have because they run really good stuff, and it has an amazing shooter with great gravity in Isaiah Joe. I mean, he is going to thrive in that system. Mason Jones is a guy who, was a good recruit out of JUCO and did everything he did in JUCO at the Division I level. Everything he did in JUCO, he was able to do. He was a good shooter. He didn't do a ton going to the rim, but he got some off. He was a good passer. Solid assist to turnover ratio. I think that backcourt is going to be really special, and they will be in a system that maximizes them. We talked a lot when I was bullish on Bama about how Nate Oates will maximize guards like Kyra Lewis. I cannot get that out of my head. Kyra Lewis, how he maximizes those guys. I think Muss will do the exact same thing with Isaiah Joe, Mason Jones, and Jimmy Witt.
Yeah, I just don't have the same level of enthusiasm. I think I'm lower on you than Witt. I'm certainly lower than you on Joe and Jones, it seems. I mean, Joe is an absolute elite shooter, right? 114 makes at 41%. But I mean, he was also playing with Gafford. Now he's the main fixture. The guy who the defense is going to be fixated on. Jones had a great season. I don't know if you would even ask an SEC fan, how many points did Mason Jones average last year? I don't think that they would guess 14. I think that they would guess a lot lower. He had a surprisingly good season for Arkansas last year. So I mean, that's solid right there. With a solid point guard, I think I'd put him more in the above average category than the top 5 SEC point guard category. But then like Silla, he's solid, right? At 14-5 in the Colonial, doesn't shoot it as well as I think that you would want from a stretch 4. And then we went through the bigs too, which I'm not a very very bullish at all on. It's requiring a lot of them to take a pretty big step forward. And guys like Adriel Bailey, I mean, he was good as like a glue guy and as a defender amongst like your Barfords, your Gafford, your Macon. He started 42 games over his sophomore and a junior season, but now his fit looks questionable with his team. I think you mentioned Reggie Chaney as a breakout guy. I think he's probably the starting center. This team it just feels like they're missing the top end talent for me.
Okay, I can buy that, but I also think there is a bump to be had for Eric Musselman. Eric Musselman took a team that had won 8 games the previous season. 8 games. They went, 9 games, 9-22 with David Carter. He took that team and they won 24 games in year 1. They nearly tripled their win total. And that was with a roster of freshman Cam Oliver, who was very good, but like DJ Fenner was a role player once they actually got talent in there. Eric Cooper left the program. Tyron Criswell was a good role player. Marquez Coleman was a really good piece, but like this was not a loaded roster. And he just flat out got them to believe, got them to buy in, put it together in a system that made sense for them. They played 4 out, 1 in. They did everything that Muss does, and they won basketball games. And then he took over a very different looking roster the next year, and they won a ton of basketball games. And the next year, a ton of basketball games. And last year they had issues, chemistry wise, and they still won a gosh darn lot of basketball games. And I'm having tough time betting against that guy when he has a roster that fits what he wants to do. When he has a potential star in Isaiah Joe, he's a really good point guard in Jimmy Witt. He's got a good wing. He's got a good big. Of course, I'm betting on a lot of top of things hitting where they need to hit for this to be a top 30 team. But at some point, like there are teams you have to be higher on than the consensus, right? Like we pride ourselves on this podcast of like not just doing, not just making a top 25 that looks like everybody else's top 25 and rolling it out there. that we're going to go in deeper, and we're going to have some bold opinions that are backed up. And I think, to me, this is a bold opinion that I can back up. It's a bold opinion I believe in, and I'm just going to roll with it. It doesn't make sense. Do they have a top 30 roster in the country? Probably not. Almost definitely not. I think, we're about to touch on New Mexico. New Mexico might have more talent. Is that crazy?
I mean, they absolutely have more talent.
But I just don't think it's just talent. I'm a big believer in Muss. I think he'll find a way, and I think if Isaiah Joe is as good as I think he is, that Arkansas still has more talent. But it's I'm just a believer, and I'm happy to be wrong if I am. But I love this core. I love the coach. I love the breakout potential of a lot of these guys. I think it's going to come together really nicely.
So you said you have them 30th. Where do you have them in the SEC?
Ooh, hold on. Let me just make sure, because I should have standings them out. I'm making my top. I have my top 100 that's coming this week. So I have Florida 1, Kentucky 2. That's an interesting flip for you. LSU at number 3 in the SEC. 4 Alabama, and 5th Arkansas.
So,
but that creates a big run of like Auburn, Tennessee. Several teams in that tier are very close to each other. Mississippi State.
Yeah. I think Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Auburn are three teams for me that I think are definitely above Arkansas. Like I mentioned earlier, 67th puts them basically as a 4 or 5 seed in the NIT, so pretty much what they were this past year. And they have them either 10th or 11th in the SEC, depending on where I finalize Missouri and Tennessee.
State of the program. Pretty important recruiting class coming in 2020 to kind of make a statement and land some kids and prove you can recruit freshmen. And they've got a good staff. I think they'll be fine. I'm just, like I said, I'm a huge Muss guy. I think he'll win wherever he goes. I know he's a tough guy to work with at times. He's a big personality, but they've got a couple of crystal balls for Moses Moody, who'd be huge for them. Although the 2 most recent are Oregon, from Andrew Slater and Dane Irvin, so maybe he'll head there. But regardless, I do think they've got some good targets in the pipeline. They'll hit some recruits. They'll hit the transfer market hard. And they'll find a way to be successful long term.
And then just the 2 guys that we didn't mention a ton. Desi Sills, who's in the rotation as a freshman, 46% from 3, 5 point per game in 17 minutes. And then Jalen Harris, who was a starting point guard, former New Mexico player. Today's the Jalen Harris Bowl of podcasting. Former starting point guard. He's pretty much a non-shooter, high assist guy though. It's going to be interesting to see how they utilize Harris and Witt together. Maybe they play Witt at the 4, right? Like a Harris, Joe Jones, Witt, and Chaney lineup at times. So that'll be interesting to see how they manage the roster with that front court there, because their best players are in the backcourt.
Yeah, I think Sills breaking out would help. I think Harris kind of is what he is. I think the reason they brought in Witt was exactly that.
Cool. Should we move on to the Lobos?
We should indeed.
New Mexico, they were 188th last year, 14-18, 7-11 in the Mountain West. Crushing preseason injury to Jaquan Lyle, who was going to be their best player. Threw off the entire roster as he was the straw that stirs the drink. They played fast, 15th in tempo, but they were expectedly 240th in turnover percentage, and the lack of a prominent point guard also reared its ugly head, I think, in the 232nd in effective field goal percentage, 262nd in 2-point percentage, and 335th in points off twos. They just weren't generating easy shots. They were 36 in free throws, and that was primarily due to their centers. Carlton Bragg and Corey Manigault were both in the top 100 nationally in terms of drawing fouls. So they were 32nd in terms of getting to the line. The 36th was points off free throws. So they were 32nd in getting to the line, only 190th in free throw percentage. That's a big inefficiency there. And they were also 280th in opponents getting to the line. So they were giving up easy shots. They were also putting guys on the free throw line. So the defense was a major concern. They were sub 200 in defense, which isn't too surprising given they were 188th overall. They were 14th in height, and that should continue this year. They have great positional size. 47th in using the bench, which the bench is much deeper this year. Being 265th in minutes continuity also hurt them. And so will a point guard be a problem this year? I mean, Lyle's back, and if he's healthy, that should solidify it. He was much maligned at Ohio State for not being a great point guard, for kind of struggling with his decision making. But in the grand scheme of things, he's a very, very good player who's taking a step down from the Big Ten to the Mountain West. So I think he would definitely give them stability from a macro perspective. And then they also get J.J. Caldwell, who apparently, according to a release that Kevin found earlier, is eligible from the get-go. Former Texas A&M point guard. He's known as kind of like a flashy pass-first guy. He'll add even more depth to that position. And they also have Keith McGee and Drew Drinnen, who are a year older and got a lot of minutes at that spot this past year. And then from an overall perspective, they're returning 5 of their top 6, only losing Anthony Mathis in their top 6. It also adding multiple talented transfers.
Yeah, I think just looking at the stats you touched on, it's important to contextualize the statistics with some meaning. Paul Weir is a pressing coach. He wants to press. He, went to some zones at times last year to slow things down when he realized it wasn't working. But for the most part, he's a press guy. He's going, and he has said this year, we're going to press again. So with the press comes, you have to win your turnover margin. If you're not going to win turnover margin, you shouldn't be pressing. You're going to foul, but you're going to get fouled because you're going to get downhill a lot. You're going to play fast. And you're probably not going to give up a lot of threes because in the half court, you're going to be up on guys. And in the full court, you're going to give up layups. So kind of contextualizing all of that. When you look at last year, they had point guard concerns because of Lyle leaving. So last year's point guard situation was some combo of, Vance Jackson creating offense, Keith McGee, who's a combo guard, Drew Drinnen when he playing point guard. They just did not have a consistent answer at the point guard position. So with that, they turned the ball over more than they forced turnovers. So, I mean, that right there is going to kill you. Because when you play when you press, you're going to give up easy buckets. You need to do that at the expense of forcing a lot of turnovers. They didn't force a lot of turnovers. It's not like they turned it over a ton and forced a lot of turnovers. They were average at forcing turnovers, and they turned it over a ton. That's just not going to work. Now, looking at the roster, they now all of a sudden have a ton of ball handlers. J.J. Caldwell, Jaquan Lyle, Keith McGee, Drew Drinnen. They now have a lot of guys who can handle the ball. So the big reason to have optimism if you're a New Mexico fan would be to flip that margin on your head. Now you have a bunch of athletic attacking guys who can help you with that turnover margin, win that battle. And then you're adding scoring. You're adding guys who are going to get downhill and get shots. Vance Jackson can get shots. He settles for threes too much, but he can get shots. Zayden Martin wants to get downhill. He's going to get downhill. Lyle is a grinder, very physical guard who can get to the basket. They're going to be even better at getting the free throw line, and they're going to have a team that creates better offense. So if you're looking for an optimism reason for New Mexico, it's that. So I think that's my assessment before I just kind of touch the whole roster, which is a complete mess because of the way that Paul Weir is recruited.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think out of all the concerning stats, I think all those are, or at least most of those are symptoms of the point guard issue, and I think Jaquan Lyle is going to solve that. I I don't know if he's going to play as much point guard now that Caldwell is ready to go from the start. But he played point guard at Ohio State. He averaged double figures. Former top 40 recruit. If he's fully healthy, that gives him a scoring guard who can really create to go along with a guy like Zane Martin who averaged 20 points a game at Towson. This backcourt is just so much more prolific now, and then the front court returns. So they need guys like Malowek and Jackson to shoot it better. Malowek, was a much better shooter as a sophomore than as a freshman than as a sophomore. And then Jackson, who is a stretch four, moving him into more of a smaller creating role, that should do wonders for his shooting percentage. And then you have Carlton Bragg for the whole season, who was only as a mid-year transfer had to sit that first semester. So that's an incredibly talented starting five right there. It's full with guys who can create, guys who can shoot. Offensively, there should be no problems with that unit.
Yeah, and let me go through the whole newcomers and outgoers because there's a lot. So 3 leave the program in Anthony Mathis, who grad transfers to Oregon, Vladimir Pinchuk, who is a sit-out transfer to the University of San Diego, and Dane Kuiper, who is like a 3-and-D wing from Alaska who graduated. Now, incoming goes J.J. Caldwell, who per that release is immediately eligible. He originally started online classes in the spring term, so that meant maybe he'd have to be a mid-year guy. In their April release, they said immediately eligible. So that's what we'll work on the assumption of. Obviously, that could change, or may not change, but we may just have that information. Vontae Hendricks, mid-year eligible from Utah, was enrolled in online classes, that whole saga with him in Fresno State, and enrolled in both schools. That was a fun mess. You then have 3 freshmen who are listed on the verbal commits page. The first one is Kurt Curry Wegscheiter, who is from NBA Africa, was cleared by the NCAA about 10 days ago. He got into UNM officially. Now he's awaiting a student visa. Classes start this week. So he has to get here pretty soon. Otherwise, he may not be eligible for the first semester. Then there's Antoine January, who is a top 150 recruit, committed to Illinois, big guy, had been recruited by New Mexico. Then it was reported by Illinois forums and message boards that he wouldn't qualify. He decommits. He signs with New Mexico, and now Jeff Grammer, who is one of the better beat writers for my money in the country. He just does a really good job keeping me informed. I know he gets some hate from New Mexico fans, from New Mexico State fans, but just as a neutral writer, keeps me really informed. Really appreciate Jeff's work. He reports that Antoine January is not expected by either side to make it to campus due to academics. That has not been officially confirmed by New Mexico or by January, but that is the report. And then finally, a freshman who has nothing wrong with him, Emmanuel Kuwak, also known as Emmanuel Andrew, who's like a 6'7" long athletic wing. I think that's everything, but it's kind of a mess.
Yeah, so starting with the freshmen, if January is ineligible, it's not a huge deal, right? You have Bragg, you have Manigault, but I bet they wish that they had one more guy there, but that's not the end of the world there. I think the other 2 freshmen is going to be tough for them to get minutes. I think Emmanuel Kuwak has the easier path. He's like an athletic combo forward who can stretch a little bit. But I still think that's kind of an uphill climb for him. Looking at this bench, I went through my projected starters with Lyle, Martin, Malowek, Jackson, and Bragg. That means that you have J.J. Caldwell coming off the bench. I mentioned Corey Manigault, who was a former Pitt player, averaged 9 and 5 last year. He'll probably play some 4 and some 5. Vante Hendricks from Utah, former top 150 recruit. He's sitting the first semester, but then will be eligible to add a scoring punch off the bench. And you also have Keith McGee, who played a lot last year, averaged 9 points a game, 40% from 3. He probably sees a smaller role. As a pressing team, maybe they incorporate a 10th guy, whether it be Drennan who was the backup point guard last year, or Emmanuel Kuak there. But either way, especially for a mid-major team, this team is incredibly deep.
Yeah, so I'm projecting a 10-man rotation. That's what Weir's done so far when he's had the ability to do it. I'm projecting Caldwell and Lyle starting together in the backcourt. So that gives you the true passer with the combo guard that doesn't hurt you size-wise because Lyle's so big. It frees up everything if you play those two guards together. Then Martin at the 3, this big physical guy. I put him as a 2. If I recall correctly in my positional rankings, I think he'll play a lot of 3, but he'll also play a lot of 2. Vance Jackson at the 4, Carlton Bragg at the 5, and then the bench rotation being McGee, Drennan, Hendricks, Malawach, and Corey Manigault. So it's 10-man. I was just doing it positionally, not by minutes for the bench. And then Kuak and Vegscheider come off the bench or just redshirt. I think it's a good chance you just sit both, especially if there's qualification concerns with Vegscheider getting on campus in time.
And they also have Tavian Percy, who's not going to see a lot of time. He barely played last year, like 25 games, I think sub 6 or 7 minutes a game. He's really on the outside looking in as well. But either way, super deep. They have guys at every position. Former high major guys, former top recruits. A guy in Carlton Bragg is a former 5-star, averaged 11, 9, and a block last year. He was, interestingly enough, 7th in defensive rebounding percentage, which is, I didn't peg him as someone who was that good on the glass. He was more of like a face-up big who couldn't stretch the floor at Kansas, which that's the wrong era to be in. To be a power forward / center, with that style of play. Kind of similar to a Paul White who established the 3-point shot during his time in Oregon. But at Georgetown, he was like a 4 that probably should have been playing the 5 that was a shooting mid-range jumpers. Bragg much better on the glass than White. White was pretty soft for a big man, but that similar kind of size and some similar offensive characteristics there.
Yeah, so we've talked about the talent. We know that's a strength. I want to bring up a major weakness before we just run through all these strengths. And this weakness can't be measured. It's not something that you can put on paper and fully understand. But it is, okay, let's go through this roster. We've talked about all these talents. But there's a reason that every single one of these talents is at New Mexico, right? J.J. Caldwell was ineligible for a year, then got 1 suspension, 2 suspensions, and was kicked off the team. Jaquan Lyle was dismissed at Ohio State. Carlton Bragg was dismissed at Kansas, got in trouble again, or at least just did not mesh at Arizona State. There he goes. Right there, that's 3 guys, you were talking about as starters who have had issues, both off, dealing with off the court issues, and how. To me, where there's off the court issues, there's usually on the court issues. I have trouble saying, okay, well, this kid's only getting arrested, but I'm sure he's a great locker room guy. There's ego involved. There's top recruits who think they're going to be the best thing in the world at New Mexico. There's all 3 of those guys. Then you have Jackson who wants to shoot. He's going to want touches. He came to New Mexico over high majors because he was getting pitched on being a star. Zayden Martin was a 20-point-a-game guy who had better opportunities. He's at New Mexico. He's going to want touches. And then you got all these guys coming back in the rotation, right? Like you've got Manigault who's going to say, where's my minutes? Dante Hendricks when he's eligible. Why is he at New Mexico? Well, why am I there? Well, I was going to play minutes. I was going to be in rotation. Keith McGee took a lot of shots, right? Like there's just so many egos, and there's guys who've been in trouble before, and you've got Paul Weir as a coach who is in year 4 as a head coach, who massively disappointed last year for his talent level. And we have to determine how much of that was I don't have a point guard and how much of that was I couldn't foster a team together. Because I don't care that you didn't have a point guard. You lost to San Jose State. It shouldn't matter. They should have been able to roll the ball out with Keith McGee, with Corey Manigault, with Carlton Bragg, with Anthony Mathis, and beaten San Jose State. And to me, Paul Weir has to show me something, because, you know, you get a boy wonder billing when you take NMSU to the tournament, and then year one you exceed expectations with this kind of scrappy underdog bunch that played together because they had to, right? They had no other option. That was Antonio Jackson, who was a scrappy kid from Keith Dambrod, and Sam Logwood, who was on his last shot. Those guys carried that team, and Joe Furstinger, and that front court was just these big physical guys who just played together. That team played hard. That team played tough. And I just have a really tough time believing, and maybe it's just a really bad taste in my mouth from last season, but there's just chemistry concerns to me. There's just a lot of things that can come up, and Paul Weir, is he the guy to deal with those things? We heard about Paul Weir having his team at 4 a.m. practice after bad losses last year, being angry in post-game press conferences and kind of saying, just seemingly confused, didn't know what to do. How much of it is solved by just having point guards on the floor? To me, I think the problems with that team went deeper, so I have my hesitations. And when you're adding in J.J. Caldwell, and you're adding in, let's toss in Vontae Hendricks and Zane Martin. And again, I've never met these kids. I can't say, this kid's actually a great kid who got, in a bad situation, right? I don't know that. But I know that there's a lot of kids who are going to want touches, many of whom have had issues with coaching staffs before, and they're going to be dealing with a young head coach with a ton of pressure in a program that is very unique because it gets a ton of media attention and a ton of coverage. And I could see it ending, less than ideal.
Yeah, for me, that and just generally blending the talent together, just even taking aside the character stuff, you mentioned just where are these touches going to come from, and I guess pressing and then therefore playing 10 guys probably makes that easier because you can kind of say, we're pressing, we're extending full court, therefore you're going to play fewer minutes. Maybe that's an easier sell, but that's certainly the number one question mark. Number two question mark for me being the health of Jaquan Lyle. Is he 100%? Can he perform? A guy who averages double figures in the Big Ten with his pedigree should be like a 16 point per game ish guy at New Mexico. Can he live up to that and be their best player, especially on the perimeter? And then my third major question is the defense, because you mentioned stylistically when you press, you want to see certain things in terms of turnover percentage. You didn't see that before. Lyle's not known as a great defender, I don't think. From my time watching him and learning about him, I don't that's not something that I can remember about him. So a bad defense that's returning a lot of guys, plus adding some kind of offensively minded guys. Not sure how good the defense will be at all.
Right, and that's another concern for me is a coach who is stylistically, very attached to that style, and has he quite proven yet that he's going to be successful running that style? And he's got a roster that has to get it together. It's just pressing requires being very together and understanding and being you can't just roll out the ball and try to press unless you're so much more athletic than everybody else. And they'll probably be that in some games and be able to get some steals, but you have to have really good communication, because if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to give up a lot of the back end, and they did last year. That was a problem. So that's another area where that chemistry is something to watch and to come into play.
People throw around lists of teams I'm most excited to watch, the most fun teams, whatever. I think New Mexico might be the number one team that I want to watch. Right? They were 188th last year. And spoiler alert, I have them right now at 47th, which would put them as the second to last team in, only in front of Texas for me. This is legitimately, I think, a top 25 team in terms of talent. Now, even as probably the leader of the New Mexico bandwagon, I wouldn't put them anywhere near 25, right? I have them at 47. Well, I mean, there is serious talent on this team. I mean, we talked about how stacked Missouri State was. I mean, New Mexico is at least a tier, if not two tiers above that of Missouri State roster in terms of just raw talent. So, I mean, I can't wait to watch this team play. And so now, is New Mexico going to be like kind of the opposite, but the same end result of George Mason last year, or we want them to make this huge jump, but with George Mason, it was running it back. With New Mexico, is like adding all these pieces. But will the result be the same?
Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable point. I don't know if it'll be the same. I have them making a pretty big jump. I don't have them making a tournament jump, but I have them making a jump. I do want to bring up, before I give my ranking, I just want to touch briefly. I talked about it a little on Twitter. The idea of bringing in talent to bring in talent. And you look at New Mexico, and they've taken a lot of risks. I've touched on this, quite a bit in this podcast. I don't think I need to go through them again. They've taken risk after risk to just keep adding talent. And I wonder what the reasoning is behind it. Is it just Paul Weir saying we can get them into school, so we might as well do it? Is it the Nevada factor? When you saw what Muss did and brought in so many good players and so much talent, where at a program like New Mexico, he felt like, I got to do the same thing. I got to take some risks. I got to try my best to get these elite talents. What's the reasoning? Because Utah State last year, dominated the Mountain West with a roster of star Sam Merrill, star Nemi Escada, and then role players: Brock Miller, Diego Brito, Quinn Taylor, Dwayne Brown, Abel Porter. Are those guys are those guys playing on New Mexico next year? Just on talent. They're not starting. Is Diego Brito starting over Zane Martin? No, assuredly not. Right? But I just don't think that level of talent is necessary to win, especially in the Mountain West. Fresno State last year was a very solid team. It was some pretty good guards and Nate Grimes, but they were. It felt like they grabbed talent for the sake of talent at times. New Mexico would have been better off. If you have a good coach, you need 2 to 3 really good players, and you need guys who fit that, and you need to be constantly building towards that system. If I were New Mexico, instead of just saying I'm going to grab a bunch of transfers, I would have said, okay, I've got Jaquan Lyle, I've got Jaquan Lyle, I've got Vance Jackson, I've got Carlton Bragg. I've got Zane Martin. Zane Martin's good. You take him if you can get him. I'm surrounding them with shooters and athletes. Give me as many athletic 6'6" wings who can shoot the 3 as possible. To me, and of course, hindsight is 20/20, because as a coach, I mean, if you can get Vontae Hendricks, you just have to say, okay, I'm going to take Vontae Hendricks. He's probably better than what you're going to get. Or J.J. Caldwell. Sometimes you're like, I got to take him. But is it worth the risk? Is it worth the risk to take another chance when you don't need all that talent to win? I guess it's an interesting philosophical question that only I would ask.
Yeah, I don't think that you can frame it as we have enough talent to win, right? I think, as a coach, I think you're, especially in a rebuilding situation, you're obliged to always try to improve the talent, right? You can't just be like, oh, I think I have enough, and then you roll the ball out and it turns out that you didn't have enough, right? That's the worst case scenario.
Sure.
Is like you would turn down a J.J. Caldwell, to grab another Emmanuel Kuak, right? And then Drew isn't good enough, and it's like, well, we could have used him, right? And then the hindsight is 2020 of turning down a player of that caliber. So I think that maybe in roster management theory, that's a good move, and maybe a Jay Wright can do that, or a Matt Painter, who have some built up goodwill. But I don't think a Paul Weir is, at the time, his second year on the job, and with a rowdy fan base that wants to be winning again, and I'm sure the New Mexico fans want to advance as far as they can. So I think adding as many talented players as possible, and kind of in theory, right, the more talent you have, the more you can stack up with the Power 6 teams, and the further you can advance in the tournament. So I think he really assembled talent that, based on talent's sake, could advance in the tournament.
I guess the way I would frame it is all talent's not created equal, and there's like the more JJ Caldwells you take, the more chance you're going to be dealing with an off the court issue. You're going to be dealing with a chemistry concern. You're going to be dealing with the you might need a Jaquan Lyle in your first year on the job just to say, okay, look at the fan base. I got Jaquan Lyle. Look how good he's going to be. And you're adding a guy who's tremendously talented, has a chance to win you a tournament game because he's so good, right? Like, you needed a couple of those guys to set the foundation. But is that how you want to build your entire program? Is, I guess, the way I'm wondering. And does it make sense to build like that when you could build with kids who, when you can build that, take those core two, three guys who can really play, and then from there saying, we're going to fill out a roster, and we're going to go from a team building perspective. And I think at times it hasn't felt like Paul Weir's done that. It's felt like, oh, there's talent, I can get him. Here you go. Here's a letter of intent.
Yeah, and I think he probably just saw like a market inefficiency, right, where he's like, these guys are a certain caliber of player that can't be recruited by that caliber of team because of certain concerns, but I can come in and kind of assemble them, right, and build this roster that I would never be able to build otherwise. So I think that's kind of the approach he took, which is certainly risky, as you mentioned with both the off the court stuff and then like the minute allocation. But it's hard for me to criticize them for doing that. I think it was pretty innovative, certainly risky, but I think it's going to pay off this year.
Okay. I have New Mexico at 69th in my top 100. So it's clearly an IT, and right behind San Diego State at 66, so 2 spots behind them. And so they're just third in the Mountain West. I think, I hate to be guy who trusts coaches, but we did two episodes today. One team had better players on the roster, and I have a 40 spot difference between the two teams. And part of that's coaching, and part of that is, my belief in some of the growth of these guys. But, talent-wise, they'll be fine. And I would love to see them, because there would be nothing more fun than New Mexico going crazy, rocking the pit, getting it nuts, having this super talented roster, and all these down transfers who have reached their impact. Remember, I was a JJ Caldwell champion back in the day. I was the biggest JJ Caldwell guy. I was a huge believer in that, making that Texas A&M team good. Lyle was a guy who I've liked. Vance Jackson is a fun guy to watch. Carlton Bragg, like these are guys that I can get behind and then believe in. But I just got to see it, and I think I maybe last year spooked me a little bit too much. But I think Paul Weir, has a lot to prove, and I think that brings up an interesting question, Brad. Where do we stand on Paul Weir, and how safe is Paul Weir? Because if they're top 75 this year, he's fine. But if they go like 18 and 16, if they go like 500, there's going to be some pitchforks. And he probably survives it because New Mexico doesn't have a ton of money to spend. But there's going to be some pitchforks.
Yeah, I think he definitely makes it to next year regardless. But he could really solidify his standing with a solid run, even if they don't make the NCAA tournament. But if they're a strong NIT team. What I kind of wanted to touch on with this is, so Weir was a guy who he had 1 year of head coaching experience at the interstate rival New Mexico State, where he had a very successful season. Now the New Mexico State seems to be set up pretty well between Menzies and Weir and now Chris Jans. So, do you think that this was a good hire for New Mexico?
I think based on who they could have gotten, it was a pretty strong hire. I know Steve Forbes was tossed around. I know, it was somewhat of an experienced hire. It was of an inexperienced hire, was somewhat of a risk, but he had recruited really well at New Mexico State. He had been, I believe, was the guy in charge of LJ Figueroa when he was committed there.
Who's a very, very, very good player, by the way. I think he's like a top 5 player in the Big East for this year. That's for another podcast. But yeah, I thought it was a great hire too. I mean, it was super surprising that the guy would go to the crosstown rival, right? Like I could never imagine like Providence hiring a URI coach or vice versa.
Siena nearly hired an Albany coach. Well, not nearly, but it was discussed at least. Siena wouldn't have done it, but the Albany coach would have done it.
But it kind of relates to something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of coaching hires, where does it matter, results aside, like what the context was versus what the context is coming in, right? Like a guy like Matt McMahon at a Murray State, like he didn't build Murray State, but he took what was left there and by Steve Prohm, and he kept it rolling, right? Now, with an opening like Cincinnati, right? You're not rebuilding Cincinnati. You're keeping it rolling from what Mick Cronin is. On the other hand, you have a guy like John Brannon who built up Northern Kentucky, right, during their transition period to Division I. So, like for Cincinnati, I would have been fine with them hiring either of those guys. But would it be better to hire someone who has experience in keeping it rolling, and then conversely, if you're a we'll just use maybe Vanderbilt for an example. Who Vanderbilt needs someone who's going to turn it around, right? So in a Vanderbilt's case, would it be better for them to hire a John Brannon over a Matt McMahon because Brannon, built up Northern Kentucky while McMahon just kept it rolling, and you need someone, to rebuild it. Weir is a guy who kept it rolling from Menzies. Maybe New Mexico needed someone who could, who had some experience in terms of rebuilding.
The thing is with Weir, he didn't even keep it rolling. Like, he took a roster that was there from Marvin Menzies, did exactly what he should have for what the roster was, and then got a better job from it. Like, in terms of, he didn't do anything that was so world-beating while he was at New Mexico State. That year, they won 28 games with that Ian Baker, Braxton Huggins, Eli Chua, Jamario Jones, Matt Taylor group. But and they kind of faded down the stretch. They had that great winning streak and they faded. The year before was the New Mexico State team. I guess they lost Siakam. But they were expected to be good. Maybe they were a little better than you thought. But it wasn't like he did something. He had this crazy, put together roster that he put together at the last second. He got Jamario Jones, but I don't know if that was intact before. I'd have to look. But for the most part, he just kept it together, and I think that makes it a little difficult to kind of balance.
Agreed there. So that's all I have on the Lobos. Just to reiterate, I have them 47th, which is second in the Mountain West, and second to last team in. So they would be in a playing game against Arizona State, which I think would be a cool game to watch. But
yeah, it would be really fun. Hopefully, like I said, like you said, I should say they should be a league pass team. Hopefully we can get a lot of New Mexico streams this year because they'll be fun. I hope I'm wrong. I really do, but I got my reservations and I would like to kind of hold those for now. So
I mean, they have those games at 11 o'clock on ESPN2, right? That's just far too late for me. I'm sorry.
Oh, come on. What are you doing? Well, it helps them Central. That's huge. That's at 10 o'clock. It means you're done by midnight. Oh, beautiful thing.
But then I think CBS Sports plays them out West games at either 9 or 10. So that's fine.
Yeah, it should be fine. We'll get a lot of New Mexico, I'm sure, if they're good, just like we do with any mid-major. But I think that probably wraps us up, Brad. Correct?
Yep.
Yeah, so great show. Once again, if you're finding the show because you're an Arkansas fan, you're a New Mexico fan, you had to get your fix. We got you. We got you for all college basketball needs. We've got coach interviews. We've got deep dives. We'll have some conference previews coming up eventually. So we'll have plenty of good content for you guys. Please subscribe. Please review everything you like. Everything is appreciated. And lots of content coming from me this coming week. I'm hoping to have my top 100 out at some point. So look forward to that. So once again, we appreciate you listening and hope you have a great rest of your week.